Well, good morning and welcome everyone. I'm Alison from the Postgraduate Association, here today with Patrick Danaher to do a excellent research design workshop uh, aimed at qualitative researchers. So we are recording, and I'll post the link to our YouTube channel where you'll be able to view it again. And I encourage everyone that's here to become a member of the Postgraduate Association, and in that way keep all these great workshops going for free for students. So I'll post a few links in the chat. Uh, okay, it's all yours, Patrick. Thanks
Thank,
so much.
thank you, Alison, and good morning, everyone, and great to see everyone here today. And as Alison said, we're looking at research design and qualitative research. And I'll say a little bit more about the focus on qualitative research in a moment. So it's really, really good to be with you and to talk about this really complex, exciting, and in the end, it is meant to be empowering and even transformative when we work out a research design that actually works for us and for the participants and so on. All right, so in terms of acknowledgement of country, I try to have a different image each workshop. This one, if you've ever visited Toowoomba, you might know Tabletop Mountain. In the photograph, you can just see Tabletop Mountain way in the background of the photo, and some intrepid souls actually ride their mountain bikes up and down that mountain, and some of them actually run. I don't do any running, and I certainly wouldn't run up or down that kind of an escarpment. But anyway, brave souls. So, and that's the Lockyer Lookout, which is particularly associated with some of the local Indigenous community. So on behalf of Empowering Editing, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm meeting today anyway, including the Jagera, Jaibil and Jalwal people of the Toowoomba region where I'm located, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So these are some of the things that I hope to cover. I do hope to leave a bit of time for some discussion at the end, so we'll see how far we get. There's a lot to go through and to think about with regard to research design, including what's in a name. Research design vis-a-vis methodology, vis-a-vis method, and so on. So some of the things I'd like to talk about, and some of the things that any of us who've conducted research and have written a thesis or even published a book chapter or journal article are well familiar with, including data collection, data analysis, research rigor, research ethics, and so on. All right, so a great pleasure to acknowledge Alison, who is really just exemplary in terms of encouragement and support. Thank you, Alison, and the equally fabulous Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. And I've said it before, I'll say it again on record. To me, from my experience, it's the best postgraduate association in the whole of Australia. I thank all of you for coming along, and I'd also like to acknowledge excellent research methodologists who have gone before us. I don't know about any of you, but certainly when I've been puzzling over methodological or philosophical questions, sometimes I've gone back to people who've gone before me, and I've found their words actually very helpful. So I like to acknowledge them in absentia. So a couple of crucial caveats. This is really important. There are lots of ways that people can structure a research design. There are lots of different ways, equally legitimate ways. And so that's really important to reinforce that there's nothing predetermined. You could make not any research design work. I wouldn't go that far, but I would certainly say that for any doctoral thesis or research master's thesis, there are probably 3 or 4, maybe even more research designs that could work for you. You can't do all of them. You have to choose generally one of them. But I think that that's important, and hopefully that's a bit liberating as well, because if there's nothing predetermined, you're not looking around for something that someone else has set up for you. Rather, you're creating the research design yourself. So in terms of the title of the workshop, as Alison foreshadowed, there are significant differences between qualitative and quantitative research designs. And this is really only about qualitative research designs, although inevitably some of the things that we'll touch on today do relate to quantitative research as well. And so if you're working with supervisors or course unit coordinators or academics or whatever, obviously you need to follow their advice if there's anything contradictory or different. And I used a few of these slides from a presentation now many years ago. All right, so Alison very kindly put this graphic together for us today, and that's a really good summary of what we're hoping to cover today: the role and value of the research design, aligning the research design with the rest of the thesis, and ensuring the research design's appropriateness. And I'm not sure about any of you, sometimes I feel a little bit lost and even overwhelmed with regard to some of these aspects. And so when I feel that way, I go back to first principles, or I go back to basics. And Alison's graphic there provides a really good summary of basics or first principles for research design and qualitative research. Now, I've used this slide in previous presentations, and I just want to reinforce, and I guess this links with the point I was making a moment ago, that nothing's preset, nothing is predetermined, and therefore a corollary of that is that it's up to you to make the research design work. And this is what I call it a scholarly voice. Some people would use that term likewise, other people would use other terms. But put it this way, when I'm examining a thesis, which I'm doing at the moment from another institution, what I want to know in the case of the research design or methodology, what decisions did the scholar make? How did the researcher approach the constraints, the inevitable constraints, and navigate a way through those constraints to end up with a rigorous, appropriate, effective, ethical research design? And so that is how I see scholarly voice vis-a-vis research design. What decisions did the researcher make? What kinds of considerations did they have? What were they seeking to achieve? How did they navigate their way around potential obstacles, or when they got to a fork in the road? If any of you who know Robert Frost's wonderful poem, The Road Less Travelled, we come to junctures in the road and we have to make decisions. Which way do we go? So that's really important, that when we're writing this chapter in the thesis or this section of the journal article or whatever, that we're really clear about what we did and why. Scholarly voice can be elusive and slippery, but you'll get there in the end. It certainly repays dividends along the way. So what's in a name? Now, I'm not sure if you've come across this already, and from your disciplines you may have other examples of this. When I started out in this, I naively assumed that there would be almost like an Esperanto, a common language of terms that even within the same discipline, and also I guess more naively across disciplines, that people would understand and would use terms in a similar kind of way. Well, it didn't take me long to find out that's not the case. And so it's really important to decide which terms you use and why, and what you mean by those terms. So when we talk about whatever we call the collection of interviews or surveys or researcher journals or whatever, plus things like autoethnography or case study or narrative inquiry, plus interpretivism or critical theory or pragmatism, whatever we call that combination of things is really important. But in a sense, it helps, I guess, that there is no Esperanto, that there's no common vocabulary. So as long as you're clear about which term you're using, you should be fine. This is the term that I like to use, research design. So if I'm working with a student, it's up to the student, of course, but I would suggest somewhere along the line, thinking about that chapter, whether that's, the chapter number varies, as we'll see, but whether that's chapter 3 or chapter 4 or whatever of the thesis, I would suggest anyway, the student thinks about calling it the research design chapter. On this basis, many years ago now, last millennium, in fact, Leedy called it or defined research design as a plan for a study, providing the overall framework for collecting, and I've added, and analysing data. And then more recently, a plan for selecting subjects, that is participants, research sites, data collection procedures to answer the research questions. And then more recently still, it's a strategic framework for action that serves as a bridge between research questions and the execution or implementation of the research strategy. So there are other ways of defining it, but that is one way of thinking about research design. And then we have other people who say they probably don't even use the term research design. And they say, no, 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 no. What you're talking about there is research methodology. And as we know, ology means the study of. So the study of research methods. And so you will sometimes see research methodology used in this way: a theory of how an inquiry should proceed, the assumptions, principles, and procedures in a particular approach to that inquiry. So methodologies make explicit the kinds of problems that are worth investigating, what's a researchable problem, what are testable hypotheses if you're using hypotheses, how the problem can be investigated using particular designs and procedures, and appropriate means of collecting data. Okay, now, if you choose to use research methodology in this way, that's absolutely fine. The only thing is you need to be clear and consistent in doing so. As long as you're those two things, you won't have any problems. Okay, now, this is the way that I use the term methodology. So back before, from my point of view, and that's all it is, I would use research design in that overarching way. And because of the derivation of methodology, I use it in this way: the theoretical framework to support the methods chosen. So it's a perspective on the research which dictates how it's approached. So examples of that: phenomenology, ethnography, action research, autoethnography, biography, case study, grounded theory, historical study, narrative inquiry, phenomenography, and there are many others, lots and lots and lots of others that people can choose. So if you're familiar in biology with that classification system of, and I always get these in the wrong order, but I'm sure people know what I mean: family, phylum, species, those kinds of things. I find that a useful metaphor for thinking about this. So in a sense, the term that you use for these things here in this list is less important than that you do have a term for it. All right, depending, of course, on what your research questions are, what your topic is, and all of that kind of thing. So just to let you know, I would say ethnographic methodology. Some other people would say, no, it's a method. It's a research method. And that's fine, as long as we know what we're talking about. Now, this is what I would call methods, but some people who would call it techniques or something else. But these are the things, a different order of classification. So interviews, surveys, focus groups, experiments, observational studies, online data collection, and also archives. Delphi study, where you engage with experts in a field and you do your research and then you get their feedback on what you're doing. The thesis I'm examining at the moment has used elements of a Delphi study, which is really interesting. Documents, researcher journal, and again, there are lots of other ways that you can collect your data. But all I'm saying really here is, as long as you've got, depending of course on your topic and your research questions, as long as you've got something that you can use to give a name to this particular level in the classificatory system. All right, so on we go from naming things to putting them in their place. So putting the research design in its place. Now, this is it's almost stereotypical. It's certainly the kind of, I guess, archetype of the way that people might set out a thesis, but also a research paper in a journal article or a book chapter. So focus of the inquiry, which is often chapter 1, the research questions. If you've got hypotheses, they're there, that kind of thing. Situating the study, the literature review, contextualizing it, conceptualizing it, which we looked at fairly recently. The research, so the middle three are what we're doing today: research design, method, methodology, ethics, data collection, and data analysis, both of which take multiple forms. And then answers to the research questions or responses to the hypotheses, and then contributions to different knowledge types. And so answers to the research questions, you might have one chapter per research question, or you might, if in a thesis, or you might have them all together and call it your findings or your results, something like that. And then often the final chapter, which may be your discussion chapter, contributions to different knowledge types, the so what about your thesis. So I think it's interesting that these three in purple are in the middle. So we might think about the research design as almost like the fulcrum of the thesis. So it's in the middle, it has to bear the weight of the entire study, of the entire text. And so it, it needs literally to be balanced, otherwise it will unbalance and topple over and won't be effective. Okay, sorry. A quick word about word count. Now, I've used this before for the other elements of it, and these, I really should update them, but these are from many years ago now. H is mine. It's interesting to look at E. I remember E's thesis very well. There was no research design because it was a conceptual study. So that's quite unusual. It was still very effective, but every one of the others had a research design or methodology chapter. And if we just look quickly, we'll see there's not a lot of difference really in the word count. C was 10,124. I was the second smallest, 10,360, up to A, who had almost 15,500 words. And then if we look at the percentage of the total word count, maybe a bit more difference there. So mine was 9.77, ranging up to 16.5% of the total word count. Now, I'm not obsessed with word counts, but they are a useful indication of the value that we assign to the different parts of the thesis. So I think that's quite interesting. Now, many years, oh yeah, okay, so now we look at this overview, the main elements of the research design chapter. And you may look at that and I certainly do not want you to be concerned in any way if your chapter, if you're writing a thesis, does not look anything like that. I'm sure that there are very, very good reasons for that. And what I said at the start, there are many different ways of approaching this. But I think it is useful to think about what are the generally understood elements of a research design chapter, even if the order changes. And so there's the biographically situated researcher. Now, some people, depending on the paradigm and so on, would be horrified by the idea of including the biographically situated researcher, because the assumption of some paradigms is the researcher is actually outside the research, is not involved, and should make no difference in terms of the way that data are collected or analysed, the kinds of research questions that are asked. And I have huge respect for that particular approach, and good research is done in that way. So for people from that paradigm, they would just draw a line through number one and just not have anything about the researcher. By contrast, if you're doing a self-study or an autoethnography, you cannot not include that. It's where you put it, the order is another question, but it is central to the research design. The idea that elements of your own subjectivity, your own positionality, your own reflexivity frame and inform your research design, but in a way that's not self-indulgent and narcissistic and all of those things. Instead, it's still scholarly and it's measured and it's open to scrutiny, open to discussion, open to analysis. Okay, now, again, what's in a name? People call these different things. We'll come to examples of this, although we have talked about this. So the research paradigm. Sometimes that includes ontology and epistemology and axiology. And certainly when I was supervising, people would say, don't say any more ology words. I can't stand it. My brain is about to explode. And fair enough. These are not easy things to do. And there are some researchers who spend their whole academic lives writing about ontology and epistemology. And thank goodness they do. So the rest of us can just go and read what they've written and see if we agree with those things. So not for the faint-hearted, but it is important because it frames our understanding of knowledge, of reality, and values and ethics and so on. Now, what I call the research orientation, qualitative and or quantitative, we'll come back to that briefly. The research methodology I was talking before, which is, case study or autoethnography or narrative inquiry or whatever. Data collection, data analysis. Now, some people write about validity and reliability, depending on your paradigm. And for some people, for some studies rather, that's entirely appropriate. The kinds of research that I've been involved in for a long time now, validity and reliability don't actually really fit. Certainly not in the classical positivist sense that if someone else came along and did my research or the research of the team I'm involved in, that they would find similar results. We would hope actually they would find different results because we would want their own subjectivities to come in. So instead, we use other terms, which I'll come to. But to me, the overarching question there is, how credible and rigorous is your research? And that's really important. And of course, research ethics and politics. Now, some people put research ethics right at the beginning because they say that is front and center of what they're doing. Anyway, all right. Many years ago, Eileen Ferlinger, she was doing an excellent study. She did a unit or a subject that I was teaching at the time, research methods and education, and she did what I still consider one of the best graphics that I've come across, and that was in 2005, so 20 years ago. So it still stands the test of time in my view. And it's not about looking at it in detail, although I will share the slides with Alison later. For you to come back to if you want to, but I just like the way that she set this out. So for her, the person you are is the researcher you are was the starting point. And so she went from here. So the person you are informs the researcher you are, and therefore you must consider ethics, you must consider qualitative and quantitative, cultural, national differences, and so on. But at the same time, the person you are links with your own life history, and that's your personal and professional experience, which frames epistemology, ontology, and so on. And also the researcher you are determines or frames your research questions, your paradigm, your methods, your techniques, and so on. Now, the beauty of this is you don't have to agree with that. You might profoundly disagree with that, but in a way that actually I have not seen in many research methods textbooks, that makes that position really explicit and clear, which helps you to agree or to disagree if you wish. Okay, so then Eileen extended this a little bit. And so she was looking at this connection between paradigms, methods, and techniques. So positivist, interpretivist, constructivist, and so on, critical theorist, post-structuralist. Of course, there are lots of other paradigms, but it's a really useful way of setting out these relationships. Now, if you look at that, and I don't want to go into detail into that, but if you look at that just at a helicopter view, there are overlaps there. And so, for instance, just in a practical sense, case study appears under interpretivism, but it also appears under critical theory. So in other words, that's a good reminder that you can use the same, some people call methodology or method, you can use the same method or methodology for different paradigms. So it's not, if you take this road, you have to have these. You can mix and match. But if you do that, you need to do it knowingly. You need to be very conscious of what you're doing and why you're doing it. But I think the other thing that this graphic does really well is to show that these are connected, which is to, to explain why supervisors and research methods course coordinators and so on are so seemingly fixated on these words and terms. They have a purpose in the research. They inform your research. They strengthen your research. They enable you to talk to other researchers and to have a conversation with other researchers who may well have a different, or probably do have a different enactment of these kinds of relationships. Okay, I think so. Yeah. Okay. Now, the biographically situated researcher, to mention or not to mention. Should we mention the war? We're not quite sure. Okay. So if you do mention it, and if you are interested in that notion, and you may well have grappled with this already, of course, which is great. So the term positionality, some of you may well have come across and may well be using. Sometimes it's associated with feminist research or Indigenous research, but more broadly, it describes an individual's worldview and the position that they adopt about a research task and its context. So the worldview, or where the researcher is coming from, links with these notions of ontology, epistemology, human nature, and agency, and so on. So if I had to do very quickly, I won't go into detail in relation to that, but as someone who's very confused about lots of things, including my own positionality and so on, over the years I've realized this word agency down here is a reminder for me. I'm more interested in reading about research and actually doing research with people who are, teachers or other kinds of professional groups, nurses, social workers, and so on, who are engaged in work in really complex professions. And what intrigues me about that is, how do they exercise their individual and collective agency against the backdrop of structure? And so Alison, for instance, excellent PhD thesis, used Foucault, who was very big on what's the overarching structure, what are the systems of power, and so on. So I certainly acknowledge those, but I just think it's easy to be overwhelmed by that. So what I'm interested in doing, and Alison and I have had a couple of conversations about this, and she is as well, what do people do against that backdrop? What sense do people make of their lives, including their professional lives, their occupations? So that's just a little bit of an indication of ontology, epistemology, and human nature. Okay, so we might, the other term there is reflexivity, and I'll keep an eye on the time. Reflexivity, where it's more than reflection. Sometimes we say, I'm going to reflect on that, even critically reflect on that, and that's fine. Reflexivity is more rigorous, it's more systematic, it's more about linking our own individual experiences with the broader context. And so it links beautifully with positionality, because reflexivity enables us to acknowledge and disclose ourselves as far as that is relevant. Not our entire life stories, but aspects of our own identities that link with and potentially create a bit of a contradiction with the research that we're doing. All right. So again, this is not about going through this in detail, but it just shows that, and you may agree or not agree, this is a composite of 4 different references that I came across who are grappling, fortunately for us, they're grappling with ontology, epistemology, methodology, and so on. And so probably at this stage, it's just having a very quick look down. And again, you may well be engaging with all of this altogether already, which is terrific. But whether it's positivism you're working within, whether it's constructivism, interpretivism, pragmatism, my own preference is interpretivism. I'm still very interested in these questions. What is understood to be real are human constructions generated as individuals and groups make meaning. And although over time I've flirted with some of these other paradigms and so on, I keep coming back to that one, because for me, I get great meaning from that. But other people might say, well, that's one criticism of that, and there are criticisms of all of these, of course. One criticism of interpretivism is, that's great if you understand how people construct their worlds, but how does that help to change their worlds, to empower people, to change structures? and so on. So that's a continuing debate. Similarly, there are critiques of each of these paradigms. So subjectivism, critical theory, critical realism, and then I like this table as well, the purpose. So post-positivism, to measure, to compare, and sometimes to predict. Constructivism, interpretivism, to understand participants' experiences and worldviews. Critical theory, to change and improve. And post-structuralism, to deconstruct and potentially to reconstruct. So we just have a very quick look at the representative research question that I've got there. So this one, the first one, was from a friend of mine from many, many years ago. Bev was really interested in cooperative learning theory. And so in Perth, she had 3 classes of Year 5 social studies. And she had one class that was doing competitive learning, one class that was doing cooperative learning, and one class that was not doing either of those for a unit. I think it went for 3 or 4 weeks, long enough to have some kinds of results. Now, ethically, she made sure that each class got the full cycle. So they went through. So none of them ethically was missing out on what she thought cooperative theory was the best one. And she did find that there were statistically significant increased learning outcomes for the students when they were doing the cooperative learning strategy. So that's an example of probably post-positivism. What are the participants' self-reported experiences of implementing a new SME management system, small and medium enterprise? So you want to know what these people's, the admin people, the workers, the bosses, the managers, what are their self-reported experiences? And of course, there are questions around self-reported. What does that mean? Critical theory, what are participants' experiences, or how do their experiences reflect the impact of broader economic and social political systems? So you're interested in power and how does it affect their individual lives? And then how can the researcher and the participants co-construct new knowledge together? For instance, about social justice representation in children's picture books. Okay, so qualitative, quantitative. I'm sure that people have engaged with that. One of the things about this is that you could look at not any of those, but many of them, and you could actually challenge that. So for instance, sometimes in qualitative research, you have many respondents, depending on the, if it's an open-ended survey questionnaire, that is your instrument, your data gathering instrument, you could potentially have as many respondents. So you might have the same survey questionnaire, you might have closed Likert scale kinds of questions for the quantitative part, for the qualitative part, open-ended questions, and so on. So some of these can be, the dividing line is not so fixed, but I guess the reason for that is, particularly if you're writing about qualitative research, even if it's part of mixed methods, that you're confident and comfortable in writing accurately about these kinds of questions. And again, why you're doing that. Okay, again, if we look at that, deductive and inductive and so on, some of these kind of shade over, but it's interesting to think about these things. So one thing that I find is really interesting, so sometimes we say research is theory driven, or we might say theory informed, and we might say that that's more deductive. So you go in with a theory which might be something I'm looking at the moment, which is very old and well established, self-determination theory, Dechi and Ryan and colleagues. So people have gone in and that's their framework. It's theory driven. And so when they're collecting and particularly analyzing the data, they're not actually looking for anything outside self-determination theory. That's something, obviously, if something came up and they thought, well, this doesn't fit, we need to look at this. But that's often the approach if it's theory driven. By contrast, whether you're doing a grounded theory study or not, if you're interested in theory building, it's typically inductive, and you go in and you're open to what the data say to you, how they speak to you. And of course, often people have got a conceptual framework when they're doing that, and the conceptual framework can be helpful in analysing the data, but it's not the only source of data analysis. Okay, so if we look at the methodologies, I'm not going to go into detail into any of those. It's just a reminder from an earlier slide, whether you call them methods, methodologies, or something else entirely. If we think very quickly, why would you have ethnography? Why would you have narrative inquiry or phenomenography? You have them because they can work for you. You have them because previous people, previous sojourners along the phenomenological journey have already done hard work for people like you coming along now and carrying the flag and taking the study further. And so that's a useful way, I think, to think about it, because it doesn't mean that you abnegate your responsibility. But if you say your study is located within ethnography, um, it does help you because there are certain often implicitly understood assumptions about what that means and how that works and what are the benefits of that, including rich data and contextually specific data and that kind of thing. Okay, so data collection, whatever you call it, whether it's methods, techniques, instruments, whatever, again from before, but it's just a reminder, um, any data collection technique, for want of a better name, has strengths. Any of them has limitations, including sometimes ethical limitations, and including their capacity to elicit people's understandings of the world, if that's what you're looking at, or their viewpoint about a particular topic, whatever it might be. Okay, data analysis. So there are lots of ways that you can do that within qualitative research: categories and codes, content analysis, discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, interpretive phenomenological analysis, narrative analysis, positioning theory, thematic analysis, and there are lots and lots of others. The key thing here, even if you don't use any of those, the key thing is to have specific examples of how you went about your data analysis to answer your research question. So again, not necessarily if you've done your analysis and I'm reading your thesis, I might look at that and think, okay, that's interesting. I would actually read that, that sample of text, the interview transcript or whatever, I would read that a bit differently. That's fine. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your analysis. It means I'm engaging with your analysis. And it means, and this is true of quant research as well, but particularly of qualitative research, it means that there are multiple interpretations of the same phenomenon. And that's a really good thing. That's a very exciting thing. And it means our research is never finished. All right, so in terms of data analysis, again, I quite like this graphic. It's not the only way to do things, but it does make explicit the relationships among the different things. So this looks very linear and iterative. You do this, and sequential, you do this, and then you do that. In reality, those of you involved in data analysis know often you're coming back here. Oh, does this mean my research question needs tweaking or even totally replacing because the alignment with the data is just not there? Anyway, so research question, data, almost like idealized, research question, data collection, and then through here, working with the textual data, if that's what you've got. And so again, reading, segregating data, using memos, annotations, creating and shaping tree nodes, creating a model, if that's what you're doing. Some people use NVivo, I've used Miro. There are lots of these software tools out there. Some people use sheets of paper, A3 sheets of paper, and have their codes and so on all over the place. It doesn't matter what you do as long as it works for you, unless the wind comes and blows your beautifully collected data away. And you think, what do I do now? Okay, so you take photos on your mobile phone. All right, now research rigor. Okay, some people would say that is validity and reliability, the beginning and the end of the whole story. I don't use those terms. Other people use them, but use other things as well. This one is a very tried and true one from, 40 years ago. Lincoln and Gruber, credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. They didn't like validity and reliability. Some people have gone back and said, no, they went too far, and we can have reliable qualitative research or valid qualitative research. There are lots of other things. So authenticity, member checking, naturalistic generalization. That to me is an example of a term that researchers develop. What does that mean? What it really means is that if you're reading something just as a general person, and you think, oh, I can make that relates to me. That links with my life. That's naturalistic generalization. If it makes sense to people, if it, if it sparks something, if it triggers some kind of connection, or even if you say, actually, that's the opposite of my experience, that's still an example of naturalistic generalization. And so resonance, significance, transparency, trustworthiness, and again, there are lots of others. The key thing is in a thesis, mostly, but not, there's no such thing as always in research, I guess, but mostly people would have some kinds of claims about the rigor of their research, and they would make some, that would be underpinned by evidence. And then research ethics. So if we might say the letter and the spirit of the law. So just as a very quick example, the letter and the spirit of the law. In our ethics applications, almost always participants are anonymous. But I worked with someone who was looking at, was working with yoga teacher trainers around the world. Andy Davies did an excellent study, and he got approval from the ethics committee for the participants to be named because he wanted them to be, and more importantly, they wanted to be. In fact, because of the name, it's a small community, they would know who the other people were anyway. And basically, some of them said, yes, we will participate on condition that we are allowed to be named. So it's almost the opposite of what we're often used to. So Andy had to go back and renegotiate the letter of the law in order to be true to the spirit of the law. And so there are lots of these things, these questions. Cui bono, who benefits from the research? Me. I benefit from the research. And when I was doing mine, I knew I was the main beneficiary. And the people, the long-suffering people I persuaded to be interviewed by me, I did try to generate benefit and longer term with publications and so on. There are ways of giving back to a community or to an individual, but it's not a straightforward correspondence. So we really need to think about that question, who benefits? And that links with reciprocity. How can the research benefit participants and other stakeholders? Whose interests are progressed and or hindered by the research? It's a really good question to come back to. Also, who has a stake in particular findings from the research? And then the effects, exercise and effects of power. If I can just give one quick example, and I'll finish after that, and that is, I was working many years ago with Lucy Jalsopkowski, who had been a school principal herself and was working in a primary school in Brisbane. And so what Lucy did, and this illustrates a few of these points, and Lucy has written a book chapter about this very issue. So what Lucy did, knowing how busy schools are, as a previous school principal, she decided that it was an ethnographic case study of school leadership and teacher leadership. So what she did was she positioned herself in the school library for a term. And she knew from direct experience that while she was there, she would get to know teachers and admin and so on, and students, although that was not the focus of her study, as they came into the library. And she progressed from putting plastic covers on new library books to taking people's classes, because she was still a registered teacher, a very good, a very experienced teacher. And so that was something that she could pay back. She could say, I'm happy, I'm happy to take your lesson if you need an extra spare lesson or whatever it might be. And she contributed in other ways. So she was very conscious about how immediately and directly, but also long term, could she feed back into that school community. But in terms of this question about interest and stake, it was really interesting. And Lucy did not expect this. But what she found was, as I think is true in most schools, there were camps, cliques of teachers, And some teachers really liked the school principal and some didn't. And what Lucy discovered was that some of the participants were seeking to use their interviews with her to get back to the principal that they were not happy with some of her decisions, some of the school policies. So that was a very human thing to do, but it gave Lucy a dilemma. What do I do? Do I tell the principal? I don't think she was a friend of the principal, but they became quite close colleagues, partly because Lucy herself had been a principal and she understood the pressures. Anyway, she wrote professionally, but directly about that kind of situation. So I think it's a reminder too that, participants have their own interests, they have their own stake. And often our research site is like a political ecology. There are different interests at play there, and we come in, and usually we don't know anything about that. And we may contribute to, we may reinforce someone's power, we may inadvertently, presumably inadvertently, challenge someone else's. So it can be really tricky in terms of all of that. So just intriguing anyway. So finally, some useful concepts, or maybe useful: alterity, the otherness. I'm still grappling with those, but they're endlessly interesting as to what otherness looks like and means in education research. Different kinds of ethics: discourse, duty, proximity, situated, utility, virtue ethics. I'm really interested in um, two philosophers, really, Levinas and Buber. And I think it was Buber who is Jewish and wrote Thou and I, and Levinas wrote something similar. They're both very interested in dialogue at a philosophical level. And so it's very hard to understand what they're writing, but that's my Christmas reading for next year, January. I really need to understand more about that. You may come across other theorists of ethics and you think, wow, I really want to take that further. Okay, so wish all of you really, really well with your scholarly voice, including your research design. There are lots of examples around, really good examples and exemplars of people who also engage with these very complex kinds of questions. Your own judgment is really important here. Readers of your thesis, your book chapter, your journal article want to know what you think, what you have done, where you position yourself, even if it's provisionally. And if you do all of that, you'll certainly have really excellent research designs. Okay, sorry. Alison has very kindly put together that graphic on the 3rd of December. So that's looking forward to that. And there are some references and there are contact details. All right. Thanks very much, Alison. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. That was really, really excellent and thought provoking. I'm just posting that link for um, if you want to join Patrick in December for that last workshop. Yeah, so comments and questions while we have Patrick for a few more minutes.
I just wanted to say that was great. That was really, really helpful for me. I'm still in the very early stages. I'm about to do my confirmation very soon. But just learning some of these new terms have given me something else to keep researching, which was really helpful because I think that's what has been challenging for me is people using different terms interchangeably. And I'm like trying to work out what they are meaning and what I should be using. So this has been really helpful. So thank you very much. And I'll definitely register for the next one as well.
Oh,
That's
great.
great. That's great, Nicole. Thank you so much. Karen Peel, I worked with, and she developed a code book, but she also developed a what do you call it? Not a glossary of terms. She didn't
Yeah.
put all of them in the thesis, but her own, because she's an academic and she's publishing and she's gone on and published other things, exactly the same thing. And she got very frustrated with people. Why can't you agree? Why, what do you mean by this? So she wrote down her position and in fact, she wrote a very good article about thematic analysis. It was published. It's been cited by lots and lots of people, and so I'll send that to you, Alison, too, just in case it's
Oh, that was
useful.
great.
Because everyone uses Brown and Clark, and they're very, very good. But Karen found a gap. She said, "Oh, what do you do at this point? And so she wrote an article based on that, just making things explicit. So Nicole, can I ask, what is your topic?
So mine is ethical use of Gen AI in early childhood education.
The best.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.